Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are discussing movement mechanics in performance and how it affects your performance. So, Ash, I think you're Mr. Movement himself, so I think this is a perfect topic of discussion for us. So, Ash, what's the first thing that I think people should start thinking about?
I think movement mechanics has become quite a hot topic in the training, sport, fitness world over the last probably 10 years or so, with a huge focus being put on mobility training and flexibility and prehab, rehab, all those sorts of drills that go around actual training. And generally people fall into two camps. You've either got people who are all over it and they're at the gym 45 minutes early before their session. They take up to an hour to warm up, doing everything they've seen online, from voodoo flossing, smashing themselves with all sorts of lacrosse balls, foam rollers,
Theraguns.
Theraguns. And they spend a lot of time before they actually get into the proper training. Then you've got the opposite, where some people literally just rock up 5 minutes late and get straight under the bar, stick 60 on, stick 100 on, and then they're ready to work.
Me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the truth or the optimal solution is probably somewhere in the middle.
As always.
Exactly. And it very much depends on your individual circumstance as to what you need to do with your individual body, because what works for somebody almost definitely won't be exactly right for somebody else. So if we break it down, what is the role of movement mechanics and all that sort of training for performance specifically? So this is the performance series. I just want to make that very clear that this is not for optimal health. It's definitely not for aesthetics. We're talking about how can you optimize your movement mechanics to perform better in your chosen sport or movement or exercise. The key things we want to achieve with movement mechanics are to either prevent injury or to increase your movement efficiency for performance. So preventing injuries, pretty straightforward. Everyone can sort of appreciate that if you move badly, certain muscles are going to get overworked, certain joints are going to undergo more stress than is optimal, and over time, through high volume or heavy weights, those tissues are going to experience some damage. So we want to distribute the workload, distribute the stress forces over the body in a more even way, which means that things are less likely to get overused and break. For the movement efficiency side of the equation, it's basically the same. Like, there is usually an optimal way to distribute force and workload across the body for a given movement, which nobody typically does 100%. So our movement efficiency can be thought of almost like technique work, where we're trying to get the body to work in the most efficient way possible, using the big muscles and the big levers to do most of the work and not overusing the tiny muscles, which can't handle as much volume or intensity. So it very closely overlaps with skill work, in that we're essentially trying to get the body to work in the most effective way possible for a given movement task. The movement mechanics work is the same works on the same principles for injury prevention and movement efficiency, but the intensity with which you perform the movements might vary. Obviously, if you're very soon after injury and you have still got some tissue damage, you're probably not going to be loading up the movements as much as you would if you're trying to squeeze out the last few percentage points in your performance. But the principles are still the same.
So you're telling me, so exercises like the internal, external rotations with the band and stuff is not going to improve my snatch or anything like that? So because of the small muscles, they're not the ones that are going to be holding that load. So
Yeah, afraid not, mate.
Okay. All this
I don't
time.
think maybe it would, but it's probably not the best use of your time to get your
No.
snatch up.
So after all that, I think that was really well put. So what you're telling me is that when it comes to our movement mechanics, efficiency is probably say key, because if you move well, the loading will obviously reflect your ability, because if you move well, then that's when strength can then start to take part, start to get involved in the best way possible without risk of injury. Now, when it comes to those type of movements that demand a high skill, so things like say the snatch, and say let's go gymnastics, let's say like a ring muscle up and stuff like that. So movement efficiency is going to be extremely key in these things. And so what would be something that you'd say what would be the first sign that someone needs to start looking at? Is it going to be their movement mechanics, or is it going to be their movement efficiency? What would be like some key things that people might have to start thinking about?
Sure. So with any movement, if it's like, let's start with the snatch because it's simpler to break down. Performance in the snatch, if we're talking about 1 rep maxing, it's clear that when you try and lift more than your 1 rep max, there's going to be something that stops you. So in an analysis of somebody's snatch, you want to look at their failed reps and see how are they failing. Is it that they always lose the bar in front? Can you see that there's an obvious shift onto one leg and the other leg's not doing much work? Is the bar wonky? Is one hand higher than the other? Is there a rotation? And depending on what faults you can see in their technique or the reason why they don't make a lift, those are the clues with which you can identify whether it's a pure lack of strength, which it almost never is for the snatch because it's such a high skill movement. But theoretically, if your 1 rep max snatch was the same as your max snatch pull and your max overhead squat, then we can say that your technique's perfect and you're not mechanically inefficient in any way. That's like the theoretical max of your snatch. So unless that's the case, there's probably something you can improve on. The main mechanical things you want to look for, like mobility or just the ability to access the positions required. So let's assume somebody's squat snatch is better than their power snatch, which obviously allows to lift the more weight because you don't need to lift it quite as high. How good is their overhead squat position? Can they access a nice deep overhead squat quickly and at speed, or is there a little bit of resistance for them getting in? And obviously the speed with which they're able to access that deep overhead squat will impact their ability to catch a snatch. I think most coaches who have a reasonable set of qualifications in either CrossFit or weightlifting will be able to identify that if someone's got a problem with their overhead squat, they're going to have a problem with the squat snatch as well. And then it's a question of identifying what is the actual limiter for that position. Is it ankle range? Is it hip mobility? Is it stability in either of those joints? Is it thoracic extension, shoulder range of motion, shoulder stability? There's a whole plethora of things that it could be. But first, what is the actual limiter? Like what's holding back you adding more kilos to your squat snatch? If all of those are all right, and actually you're just not really pulling the bar high enough, it's rare, but it does happen.
So I guess also that if you feel that your snatch is perfect and that you're moving efficiently and you're still not improving your strength, then you might need to obviously look outside of just beyond the strength. So then you might have to look at your programming and so forth, because I guess that then starts to, if you take a bird's eye view of it and you say, right, cool, I'm snatching on a Monday, I'm doing, say, pull-in gymnastics on a Tuesday, so maybe like some ring muscle ups. I'm then going to do some maybe cleans on a Wednesday and stuff. So there's a lot of load going through those shoulders. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. That can be completely fine. But you need to ask, if you're trying to improve your snatch and you're finding you're not improving as easier than other things, you may have to start thinking maybe it's actually the volume through the joints. So then you want to start to then, that's going to be taking considerations of like that's like prehab in a way. So that your prehab is not doing certain things to make sure that you can focus on your snatch. Because if that's a priority for you, then you might need to ease off, say, the ring muscle ups and maybe go for, say, pull-ups, say strict pull-ups or ring pull-ups or something like that. So you have to adjust. That's if you're having an issue with a certain movement. Maybe think beyond just, I'm not improving strength in this movement because I'm not strong. It might be just because you're overloading something beyond that you're capable of at the moment.
Definitely. And I think we'll probably do a deep dive on programming as a separate episode because it's so important, especially within the sport of CrossFit. But that's a huge factor, that if you've pre-fatigued a certain group of muscles, you're probably unlikely to be able to perform to quite the same extent as if you were fresher. And I've had one CrossFit athlete who I coach complain about exactly that, where they do their strength work the day before their weightlifting and they always feel drained and exhausted and don't have quite the same snap as if they were fresh. But for them, because they're at a high level, they need to be able to do that. So actually I want to train them in that state. So even though their weightlifting numbers might not be as heavy as they could be, it has more transfer to the sport.
Exactly. And that's obviously the understanding, which I know we've touched on before in other episodes, of understanding what your intent is, your goal. If your goal is to improve your snatch for, say, an egotistical reason, that you want to build your snatch, and that's completely fine, and it's not for competition because you're not competitive at a high level, then that's fine. Then maybe you might have to pull back on certain things as you focus. That's why people go through off seasons. That's why people focus on their strength, because these things all play a part when they're playing against each other. And I guess when it comes to like, say, CrossFit training, especially as a recreational thing for performance, it's trying to find that sweet spot, that balance between everything. And so that might mean not going to the gymnastic class for a while because you're really trying to work on your strength, and maybe then increase your, say, your weightlifting classes, because they normally fall on the same sort of days. So instead of going to gymnastics and weightlifting and this, and you just got to think, these poor shoulders are taking an absolute battering. And that's what, when it comes to CrossFit, is shoulders and your hips and your knees. So obviously they're your joints, but they're going to take an absolute battering. So with such a high skill movements throughout CrossFit, you need to take care of them.
Definitely. And I think it comes back to something we discussed on an earlier podcast, maybe the What's Your Why one, on budget allocation. Like everyone has a finite amount of resource, whether it's time, energy, money, whatever it is. And I think this links back round to the movement mechanics nicely, in that assuming you do have some limit on your training time in the week, how much of it do you want to spend on movement mechanics versus, air quotes, like actual training and training hard? Because movement mechanics will improve your performance if they're designed and applied correctly, but you still, so sticking with the snatch example, you still need to snatch. If you want to snatch as heavy as possible, you still have to snatch. So the balance between movement mechanics and snatch, like obviously if you had 6 hours a day to train, then you could probably do all the movement mechanics required and all the snatch training required and loads of accessories and dump loads of time into your recovery as well. But assuming that's not the case, what's your personal blend? And as always, it depends. If you're very dysfunctional, if you've got loads of issues going on, then you're going to need more movement mechanics. It also depends on where you are in your season. If you're coming close to competition, you've got to be getting your body ready for the demands of that competition. And basically, the more competition specific training you can do, the better. So you'd be looking to actually ramp down your movement mechanics, because you want, like, so if you've got a movement like a snatch and you've got a compensation, say you use one leg more than the other, as a really simple one. At the moment, with your current movement mechanics and motor patterns, that is the most efficient way for you to lift the most amount of weight. It's not optimal long term from an injury prevention point of view. It's not optimal long term from an actual weight on the bar point of view. But if we're going to competition tomorrow, that will get you your 1 rep max rather than a perfectly symmetrical overhead squat when you catch. So us trying to correct that the day before competition isn't a good use of our time. We want you to just be ready to lift and have your body robust against the demands that it's about to experience. So when we're looking at allocating movement mechanics time, the off season is a great opportunity to get everything moving as well as possible and lay foundations with which to load up volume and intensity on your key movements. But as we peak for competition, we'll start to pull bits out and basically do what we need to keep the body healthy and avoid injury, because something Gus said I really liked actually when he came on was the best athlete's the one that's not injured.
Yeah.
And the point is basically if you're injured, then it doesn't matter how well you perform or you could perform because you're unable to because you're injured. So a really key part of the movement mechanics is just keeping the body able to continue training, because somebody training and improving at a slightly slower rate will overtake. It's a tortoise in the hare type thing, isn't it? Where you will overtake somebody who trains and improves really quickly, but has an injury and they're out of the game for 4 or 6 weeks.
So I think with that as a bit of a practical application, say for our listeners, is that if you're someone that competes at a high level or competes, as you said, like understanding that when your season say starts is key, because then you obviously need to start to adjust your training accordingly. But if you're someone that is doing this as a self-improvement thing, that you're doing this to improve day in, day out, this is where you might want to think, do you know what? I'm not going to ever push to that absolute limit. I'm always going to flirt with it. So I'm going to get close, but I'm going to probably work towards more like my 85, maybe going towards 90% every so often when I'm feeling good, but not actually maxing out. Because the thing is that maxing out is then where the risk of injury obviously increases. Your movement mechanics are incredibly important. So if you can actually focus more on improving your movement mechanics and improving your overall strength and capacity in whatever it is, so using the snatch as example, so always say if you're building to a heavy, say 1 for the day, and knowing that you still had a little bit more left in the tank is so much better than failing a rep, which is, I know why the Chinese, they don't fail the reps, stuff like that. If they do, that's it. They move on type thing, but they pretty much don't. Now, this is them, but you have to understand your why and your goal behind your training, because if it's programmed up on the board that you need to do a 1RM snatch because you've been building it forever, building in your program to that 1RM snatch, you need to say, okay, cool, I'm going to work till it feels like a heavy 1 for the day. I need to understand my capacity, because my movement mechanics and stuff like that, and my movement efficiency is more important to me because I'm in it for the long term, which is then when we then, as you mentioned earlier, this is understanding the difference between health and performance. Mm-hmm. And even if you're in it for the game for not competing, you can still perform because you're performing against yourself. So you are still training hard, but that's then when you need to remember that movement mechanics is definitely going to be pretty key to keep you in the game for long term.
Exactly. And I think it comes back to one of the things we spoke about before, the difference between testing and training. Like if you're training, you're looking for the stimulus that moves you forwards. If you're testing, you're trying to find your limit. You're trying to max out and see what you're currently capable of. When you're testing, that's when your limitation will hold you back.
Yeah.
And that could be a technique limitation, it could be a strength limitation, it could be a biomechanical limitation, and that's basically when you snap your shit. Like if your structures aren't strong enough, if your like a certain muscle's not strong enough, that's when the injuries happen. So if you're in a competition and you're going for the win, maybe it's worth that risk. But if your goal is just constant improvement and slowly or incrementally performing better over time, you don't want to find out where you break down. So getting the stimulus and leaving the gym slightly better than when you arrived, that is a smarter decision.
Yeah, that's improved performance. That's exactly what most of us are training to do, to improve day in, day out. So that is your form of performance. So as for the listeners to kind of have a takeaway from this, is in what would maybe be something that you would recommend to think about? So when would someone need to know? Is it going to be a movement efficiency thing? Is it going to be a movement mechanic thing? Or like what should someone do? And maybe how do they How do they strategize around it to improve?
Good question. I think if they've got performance goals and they're continuing to make progress and everything feels good, just carry on. Just keep training, keep slowly progressing. It's when you hit the plateaus or when you get the pain or when you see something's not quite right, that's probably when you should apply an intervention, either by seeking help from somebody or using just like filming yourself doing your exercises to critique your own technique and see what's going on and what's actually stopping you from doing more. Obviously, if you need the expertise of a coach, they can probably identify things a little bit faster. But the one thing I say, which always falls on deaf ears, and I completely understand why, is that nobody cares about injuries until they're injured, and nobody cares about movement mechanics until they've got injured. And I don't know if that can ever change, because until you felt the pain of an injury and you felt the frustration of not being able to train fully, it's hard to justify spending time on movement mechanics and like prehab, for want of a better term. However, if you reframe that in your mind as technique work to boost your performance, then I think it gives it a lot more weight and eligibility to take up your training time, because then you think, actually, me doing these less sexy exercises is going to result in an increased performance. So I'm not doing rehab and, boring, mundane, weird exercises. I'm actually doing something that's going to add more kilos to the bar, and that is the truth. And it's your movement vegetables. I think that's the phrase.
Love it.
They're not the favorite part of the meal, but they do keep the body moving well.
Yeah, I guess in a way, there's like using you as an example for when you was trying to improve your 5K runtime over lockdown. I think that's a good example, because like you knew where certain weaknesses were and stuff like that, so you was able to run. So when things did start to break down, obviously you got an assessment, you got external eyes looking at you, even though you pretty much knew, but you wanted to see what someone else said that was, say, further along the journey than you, and being able to maybe identify things that you don't know, and then you was able to action those things that you was then told, and then it took away the niggles that you were having. So, and I guess that's the thing, it's like when a niggle comes, it's just the precursor to the big fuck up, basically. So you're doing snatching and your shoulders are hurting or your traps are always sore, might mean to maybe talk to someone and say, why is this happening? Because that's the thing, most likely it's then going to be a movement mechanics thing, that something's just not working right. And if you don't improve that early doors, it starts to really negatively impact, because inevitably you do get stronger because you're doing the same thing week in, week out and so forth. So you will get stronger. So these muscles will take the brunt of the force for as long as they can. But then, as you said, once they snap their shit up and then you're fucked, that's it. And then you're normally out of the game for a lot longer. But if it's, don't get me wrong, understanding the difference between, say, DOMS, like you got that delayed onset of muscle soreness, that's a bit achy. That's very different to, my shoulder, my right shoulder. Normally it's one side. If one side is hurting more than the other, it's a good precursor to say to you, maybe have a look. So that's where, as Ash said there, like filming yourself beyond the egotistical reasons of Instagram and stuff like that, and actually using it as an assessment of your movement. Because if you don't want to hire a coach, but you can find all this information online, having your videos of yourself move, especially say under fatigue, is a really good tool to see for progression.
Definitely. I think the key word in what you said there is that it's always the right shoulder. Any sort of chronic discomfort, niggle, pain that you get after certain movements is a massive clue that tissue is taking more force than probably the body wants it to. Whether it's the guilty party or not is a different question, but it is a red flag to say, hang on a minute, this exercise is all getting done by this muscle or joint. So that's probably not optimal. Like, if one of the things Jowsey at Red Pill always says is when somebody does a leg day or does squats, he doesn't want them to say, oh yeah, my quads are really sore. It's like, I want everything to be sore. I want everything to be working together, and it's just legs all over, because the whole body is working in perfect harmony, and that is the body working in unison, because then you've overloaded the whole system in proportion, and everything's working together. Whereas, like, one of the things I ask people when they come in for a movement screen is, when you do whatever the painful exercise is, do you notice that you're sore on one side versus another, or like one muscle group versus another? And that's a big clue as to where the force is going, essentially. Like, it's all going in my left hamstring, or I never get sore glutes, or those sorts of things. And I think
I just wanted to reiterate the point where, if, say, for instance, your shoulder's a bit sore, doesn't mean that your shoulder is the problem. And I know that Ash always that this is the thing. It's always the classic thing. You go to the doctor and they say, or whoever, you say, oh, my shoulder's sore. Pull down your pants. I'm joking. They don't do that, I hope. But no, you go to say your physio or something like that, and oh, my shoulder's sore or my elbow's sore. So everyone's like, oh, looking at the elbow, but actually the dysfunction carries on up to, say, the shoulder, or the shoulder sore. It's actually because there's an instability in somewhere else. That is where the professional eyes really do make a difference, because a lot of the time the pain is just the end result. It's the first break in the chain that it can, say, isolate. So when you've got a sore knee, it can come from the ankle up or the hip down type thing. It's normally, that's just the point that all the pain can gather to stop you moving. So it might be the knee or the shoulder, but it's good to maybe take a step back and seek professional advice. So I think that just finished that one off nicely there. So guys, as always, please share, like, do all that malarkey. We really appreciate it. If you're not subscribed to the podcast already, please do so. If you are enjoying this content, obviously you can find us on all your usual platforms and YouTube. And apart from that, thank you for all the reviews, as they are making a difference for us. They're also giving us a good direction of where we need to take our podcast, or where people want us to take it. So if you do have any suggestions, feel free to contact us on any of the social platforms, like, say, Insta, lunge@lunge.lift, or email us at contact@lungeandlift.com. But apart from that, thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.
Yes.